Following the color schemes and font variables, it's time to move on to the third block of theme development. Today we are going to cover borders, font sizes and spacing. And additionally, I will show you how to use your own PNG images as icons for your table of contents. There is a lot to do. Grab a coffee, get yourself comfortable, start your editor of choice and let's get into it. I am starting with the front page of my world again. This is the point where I left Anvil at the end of my last video, and there are a few changes I want to make today. First, I need to adjust the font sizes of my headlines so they become scalable. Second, the borderline below this H2 heading needs to be replaced. Third, the table of contents will get some custom icons. And fourth, the follower widget will get a style. First, let's get some theory out of the way. In CSS, there are two kinds of measurements. Absolute measurements, like pixels, are always the same. 16 pixels are always 16 pixels, no matter the display size. Relative measurements, like for example EM, will calculate the size based on some other measurements. So if the user changes the base measurement, everything else will change with it. Let's have a practical view to this. If you have a display, let's say a monitor, with 1080 pixels in height, a font size of 16 pixels can appear pretty big. If you have a monitor that has 1440 pixels in height, 16 pixels will suddenly appear smaller, but the size is still 16 pixels. And for the other extreme, a display that is only 800 pixels in height, like a mobile phone, will experience the font size as too big. Relative measurements, on the other hand, will easily scale with zoom, different font sizes on different screens, and so on. And since they are always relative to something else, a whole website can easily adjust to that one changed value. In this tutorial, we will make use of two specific variants of relative sizes, EM and REM. So what's the difference? EM will have a look at the font size defined for the parent element and adjust itself by applying a multiplier. So something with a size of 1.5 EM will have 1.5 times the size of the parent element font size. This will lead to some crazy upscaling if you apply it to fonts and nest some elements into each other. REM, on the other hand, will always be referencing the defined base font size. This is not the font size you define in your backend, but the default world Anvil base font size of 10 pixels, which can be overwritten by the browser. Since you are always referencing that one, never changing value, everything will be more consistent no matter the nesting. So where do we want to use which? If you have something that needs to be very consistent and always the same, like font sizes, use REM. If you want to have something that is attached to the element font size, like spacings, use EM. And now, on to actually adjusting things. First, I want to adjust the titles of my world. This means the world name on the front page and the article titles. By default, the World Anvil theme gives them a font size of about 42 pixels, which is an absolute measurement. I will start with 3.5 REM with my font size and then adjust it as needed. To do so, I will type in font size, 3.5 REM into my editor and then test it. I think this needs to be a little bit bigger. Keep in mind that different font families behave differently and my measurements may not be suitable for your fonts. I settle at 4 REM for the H1 in this font family. From here you will be able to adjust every other headline the same way. Personally, I would recommend that you have increments of 0.5 REM in font size for the H2 to H5 headlines. Doing all of this will make your world more accessible for people who use the accessibility features on World Anvil or who adjusted things in their own browser, while also maintaining a certain consistency. Relative sizes are really great for that. Each element in HTML has 3 layers around the actual content, which are sometimes more and sometimes less prominent. The outer layer is the spacing towards neighboring elements, which is called margin in CSS. You can have either a general margin, which makes space into every direction, or target top, bottom, left or right as a single margin. Be careful though. If you have two neighboring elements with a margin applied to them, they will add up and make the total space between these elements. The next layer is the border, which is in CSS also applied as border. You can have a border surrounding the whole element or target top, left, bottom or right individually with it. The thin line below the H2 headings in World Anvil standard theme is a border bottom, for example. The third layer is the padding, which defines the spacing between border and actual content. As with the other layers, you can target the general padding or the padding of each direction individually. In this part, I will focus on the border. In CSS, your border definition has 4 parts. First, placement. This defines where your border appears. So if it is all around the element, only on the top, or only on the left and right side. Second, weight. This will define how strong the border you are applying is. Again, you will be able to target the border as a whole or each side individually. You can even work with the top-bottom or left-right pairs. Third, style. This is the visual appearance of your border. The most common ones are solid for a solid line, dashed for dashed lines, or double for simple double line. I linked a reference for all the available border styles in the description down below. Of course, you can go funky and apply a different style to each direction of your border. Fourth, the last part of your border definition is the border color. If you don't give it a specific color, it will take the font color as a border color, so keep that in mind. Before we start with own borders, I will show you how to get rid of existing ones by deleting the border on the H2 here. To do so, I go into the corresponding code block and type border bottom none. This will delete any defined border bottom the element has. While you could also just override this with your own style, I define my new border in a new line. This is mainly to remind me that this element originally had a border assigned. In a new line, I will now assign my own double line border to this heading. I want this to appear only at the bottom of my element, so I type border bottom again. I want the border to be depending on the font size, so I started with 0.125 EM as weight. For the style, double is what I want to have, so I can create my double line. The last element I add is the color variable, which points to the same gold I want to use for most decorative elements of my theme. I run a quick test and halve the border thickness to make it less prominent. Looks great, but we can do better. I want to add some sort of rounded border, so I start a new line again and add a border radius. Again, this will be dependent on the font size, so I set it to 0.25 EM, quarter of my font size. Another quick test reveals the next problem. This headline looks great when it's centered, but other text alignments make it wonky. I also want to make sure that the border is as close to the headline as possible. In my code block, I enter text align center to make sure the headline is always centered. To remove the spacing between headline and border, I add a padding 0. To remove the all caps part, which doesn't look good on my font, I enter text transform none, which will allow the text to appear as it is typed instead of in all caps. And with that, the border part is done. By the way, if this video was helpful so far and you want to see more tutorials, you can subscribe to the channel and activate the bell, then you won't miss a thing. Thanks for that. Next, I want to spice up my table of contents by using custom PNGs as icons, which I then can use from the backend as I would with Font Awesome icons. How to do that? That's easy. Upload your PNGs to World Anvil and open each of them in a new tab to copy the links to these images. Then add a variable for each of your icons, which holds the URL to these images. Why? Because if you want to change these, you can do this from your variable section without touching anything else. Just make sure that your links don't contain any spaces when you paste them into your editor. Now you will need some code blocks. One should hold all the generic information which applies to every icon you want to use. For me, this is the width and the spacing between the icon and the neighboring text. The other ones will be the actual icon classes and tell your browser which icon to use as a content. The icons will only appear in the user CSS area of World Anvil, so we don't need to target the other parts. But first, as usual, I will start with a comment telling me that I define custom icons down below. Did I mention the importance of comments yet? My generic class will be called custom icon, so the CSS targets user CSS custom icon. Within that new code block, I set a fixed width depending on the font size again by using width 1.5 em. The spacing between icon and text will be half of the font size, so I will have a margin right of 0.5 em. Using this definition will allow the height of the icon to adjust proportional to the width I have assigned here, so I don't need to care about this. Now you need to create the icon class for each of your icons. It will only contain one single command, content, and then the value assigned here will be the URL variable you defined earlier. That's the CSS part for now, so let's use them. In the World Anvil backend, assign both the generic icon class and the specific one to the category or article. You will do this right where you would usually put in the font awesome icon. When you're going to test, you will probably notice that the links are not aligned properly. So we are going to fix this too. Since you want to target only these specific links, you will need to get more precise with telling CSS what to change. This means we work from large to small. The element we want to target lives in the user CSS area, so that's the first part. It lives inside the category list class, which is then the next part. And within that list, it is the h5 elements we want to target, so this is the last part. Inside the code block for this address, I set the display to flex. We will cover flexbox in a later tutorial, but for now, we will just cover this specific use case. In a new line of code, type align items center. This will align the items within that h5 element vertically and center them. So this is exactly what we want here. Give it another try, and this looks great. The follower counter will require most of the things you've learned so far. You don't have to use the counter though. Any predefined element on the World Anvil page will work just fine. As usual, start the new code block with a comment at the beginning. In this case, you want to target one specific container, the follower container, but you will need to target the panel class within that container since this holds most of the styles. So we want to target user CSS, followers counter, panel with our block. First, I want to get rid of the things I don't want. I set the border radius to 0 and the background to transparent. Then I will add a border, just like you learned earlier in this video. I will also add a font family and a font color here before I go on and test it. As you can see, the font and font color do not adapt. Why is that? This is because there is still an H4 heading within that panel that contains the actual text, as well as the link. To fix this, I simply move the definition of font and color to a new code block that addresses the H4 within the followers counter, and only this one. At the same time, I adjust the frame a little to make it more visible. From here on, you will have to test and adjust details as you go, which isn't particularly difficult thanks to the variables you defined. I play around until I find the right font and font size for that text. However, this still doesn't affect the link, so I add the link to the same block as a separate address for the CSS. Just copy the existing address, add a comma at the end of it and paste the address again. Then add an A at the end. This applies the styles you defined here to the links too. To get rid of the underline of the link, which disturbs the appearance, I create another code block for the link and set the text decoration, which is the underline, to none. To ensure that the link is still recognizable as a link, I add a hover and a focus effect. This is done by using the same address but adding a :hover or :focus at the end. Finally, in this code block you define how the link should differ when you move the mouse over it. In my case, it then gets the light purple color that the other links currently have. And that's it for today. You can already do a lot with everything you have learned so far. Originally, I wanted to include a background image for the quote box in the video, but that is so extensive that we will save this for another tutorial. Next week it will be a little bit more practical and will have some direct application. Everyone gets a proper starting page, and I will show you how to create some interesting effects. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give me a like and subscribe so you don't miss any more tutorials. I will see you next week. Bye!